It is my absolute pleasure to introduce our next panel. I have to tell you, this is actually the coolest job in the world because I'm backstage and there's all these amazing women coming through and I am suffering from rock star glow back here. It's like, oh my God. And it's just one after another. It was incredibly difficult building this conference. Our committee just thrashed over it because there are so many remarkable women in this city. There are so many remarkable women. And once we had set our panels, then there were other people who come up and said, well, why didn't you consider da-da-da? And we're like, we don't have a week. And so we're incredibly grateful for the people that we've had participating with us, who have been helping with us, our collaborators. I can't say it enough. So without more ado, let us go to our next panel. And somebody took my notes. Hold on just a second. This time it wasn't Anise Parker. She did that three conferences ago. She walked off with my notes. I had to ad-lib. Okay, so first of all, how'd you guys like lunch? Yeah, can we have a round of applause for Claire Smith? Oh my gosh, that was so good. I had two chicken salad sandwiches. Okay, our moderator for our group is Council Member Ellen Cohen. She's representing District C in the Houston City Council. Go ahead and come on out, guys. Okay. I wish we had like an arch they could come through with cheerleaders and pom-poms. Okay, and our panelists are Dorothy Gibbons, co-founder of The Rose, a Houston-based nonprofit providing quality breast care health services to insured and uninsured women. Then we also have Nikki Van Hightower, former Houston City women's advocate and now a retired senior lecturer in political science at Texas A&M University. And Gracie Saenz. She's a former member of the Houston City Council and currently a partner in the Opal, Goldberg, and Saenz law firm. Ladies and gentlemen, advocate.
Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've heard some wonderful things about the previous panels. I think I see Judge Fry there, yeah. And I understand that we're not supposed to get political, and I said, Judge Fry didn't get political? But apparently not, so okay. We'll try and behave ourselves up here. I can't guarantee it. What I'd like to do, and I know that each panelist was introduced very briefly, but I have a little bit more in the way of bios, and I'd like to read them because I really think not to mention some of the things that these terrific women have done would be unfair to you and unfair to them. So if you don't mind, I'm just going to go in a bit. And for me, this is particularly poignant because each of them has touched my life in a way that I never would have imagined. And there's an expression, coincidence is God's way of remaining anonymous. And the coincidence of our relationships are really interesting. So let me go on and just introduce them a little bit more fully. Dorothy Gibbons, who founded The Rose, a Houston-based nonprofit providing quality breast health care services to insured and, more importantly, uninsured women. And she founded that with Dr. Dixie Malello in 1986. Now, for me, that is particularly poignant because in November, I will be celebrating 49 years since my breast cancer surgery. And it means a lot. It means a lot to know these services are being offered to everyone. Today, The Rose is the only freestanding, non-hospital-based facility to be recognized as a breast imaging center of excellence. The Rose is a leader in healthcare delivery, and its programs are replicated nationally and internationally. And Dorothy herself has won numerous awards. Community Health Leadership Award by the Episcopal Health Charities, Houston's first Fearless Woman awardee, and the first recipient of the Trekker Award, and Yoplay's Breast Cancer Champion. So, Dorothy, thank you, and thanks for all you do for all of us. We appreciate it so much. Gracie Saenz is a partner in Opal, Goldberg, and Saenz law firm with her legal practice emphasizing administrative law and commercial and international business. She was a member of City Council from 1992 through 1998, and again, for me, that touches me because she set a wonderful example for other women that followed her, I being one of them, And furthermore, she was were you the first female mayor pro tem? I think so. And I'm fortunate to be a mayor pro tem now. So Gracie, thank you for all you did to set the stage for women on city council. So grateful. And just recently, among her other awards, Gracie was recognized by Houston City Council last week by a special honor, honoring her as an outstanding champion for Hispanics throughout the city, not just women, but for all her involvement. And her children were there, and her grandchildren were there, and it was very exciting. We're very proud of you, Gracie. And finally, Nikki Van Hightower, who earned her PhD from NYU and wrote her dissertation on the politics of female socialization, looking at women's participation in state and local government. Nikki says, quote, "What I learned about the discrimination and discouragement women experienced while attempting to realize their full potential in life served as an inspiration for me to transition my role from interested observer to that of active participant for change." Nikki was appointed the Houston City Women's Advocate by Mayor Fred Hoffines in 1976. The New York Times labeled her the best-known feminist in Houston. Her appointment to the role was critical in the city's selection as the site of the 1977 International Women's Year Conference, which of course we're celebrating today. Nikki established the Houston Area Women's Center, so I'll pause there and say Nikki touched me, because I was asked to serve on the Women's Center board in 1979, and at that point it was kind of hard to get people to serve on the board because they thought we were a group of wacko radical feminists who wore headbands and smoked funny cigarettes, some of which was true, but not all of it. And I was fortunate to follow Nikki after she left, and Nikki served as the executive director until 1986, when she was elected Harris County Treasurer. She's now a retired senior lecturer in political science at Texas A&M University. Thank you all three of you, for agreeing to be here today and for touching my life personally. I'm so grateful. So, on to the questions. Okay. Each one of you, when you have a chance, please tell us about your experiences as a woman advocate and as an advocate for women. What changes and challenges in particular inspired you to want to spend your life fighting to right the wrongs? And Gracie, maybe we'll start with you.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be with such great women here. And I'm going to start off by, first of all, acknowledging someone very special and someone that helped me as well and encouraged me so much, and that is Phyllis Fry. When I decided to run for city council, the individual that encouraged me, of course, was Judge Ali. Kept saying, Gracie, we need good people on the bench. We need good people running for office. We need people that are willing to come out and advocate and well prepared and so forth and so on. And so the discussion went something like, yes, Judge, I agree with you, Judge, and as soon as you find them, I will support them. And never knowing that one day I would decide to take the step forward. And so when I went to the courthouse to tell him I was going to do this, Phyllis was there. And we were having this conversation, and I said, I'm going to go ahead and run for city council. She took out her checkbook and became the very first person to donate to my campaign. So I appreciate that. I guess basically what it boils down to is you walk the talk. Born and raised here in Houston, Texas, one of 9, dad and mom, 11, grew up in El Barrio El Crisol in the 5th Ward. I was actually born in the 5th Ward here in Houston. My father was born in Houston in 1926, and in 1933 there was a huge removal of Mexicanos throughout the United States, including U.S. citizen children. It was called repatriation back to Mexico. Many of those stories have not been told. And unfortunately, it's part of our history here in Houston and in the southwest part of the United States. Father was actually baptized at Our Lady of Guadalupe, came back and as an adult, and every day of his life here in Houston, he always carried his birth certificate in his wallet. So part of advocating was, of course, your own history and what has happened to you and your own experiences. And so I, as a child, was experiencing growing up in a barrio that was poverty-stricken. There was a lot of violence, drugs, gangs, you name it. I didn't particularly care for my neighborhood. And there were teachers, Ms. Cole, that actually helped me along the way. And they said, if you get a good education, you will be able to get out of this poverty. So my fourth grade teacher, my fifth grade teacher, just so happened to be individuals who had gotten their education via the GI Bill, Mr. Dominguez, Mr. Garcia, and they told me, Gracie, you can go to college. And in my mind, that set the course. I very early on was advocating already, because every time something was happening in our family, my mother would take me to translate. And she would pull me along, and if there was a question to be asked, she would say, pregúntale, ask. And I would have to ask the question in English and then translate to Mom in Spanish, and it was back and forth. And of course, that set the stage for later on in the courtroom, again, advocating for my clients. I was a woman who had a lot of obstacles placed along the way. And what I realized is if they shut the door on me here, I learned how to climb the roof and get in, go to the side, or go under. Whatever it took, I was going to get to the other side, and no one was going to tell me no. And that also came from my mother. Mother always told me, do not be afraid, y hazte fuerte. And hazte fuerte is be strong. Do not be afraid, no tengas miedo. So as we were growing up, those were things that I was cultivating, I was practicing, but there were so many injustices in our community, so many moments of oppression, and so many moments of discrimination. And I could go and tell you so many stories of, third grade teacher who decided she was not going to pronounce my name in Spanish. My name was Graciela, but by God, she couldn't say it, so therefore my name was going to be Gracie. Gracie, Gracie Allen, George Burns. As a third grader, I didn't know who they were. But as my teacher, I said, she must know better, so my name became Gracie. And that was okay. I tell people, if you want to say Gracie, but if you can pronounce Graciela, go for it. And that's one of the first times that I started to realize that there were those that didn't particularly see us the same way. In the 7th grade, again, honor society, I was getting great grades, but I was being told I needed to take not economics, but home economics. I was being told I couldn't take biology, or I couldn't take my geometry or calculus because I was supposed to be taking typing. And I was supposed to be becoming a good secretary eventually. My counselor was not very encouraging. He said, mostly women like you, Gracie, stay at home. You have children. And education should really be for the male who needs to be responsible for the family. And it wasn't just the counselor, it was also my father, who was Latino, Mexicano, and he was of the same opinion. Mijita, no te va a servir la educación. Education is not going to be worth it. So he too felt that I should be getting up to my high school degree and then go on to work. I, though, was encouraged by other women in my walk, and that was very important. Women that I didn't even know of at the time. The PTA president who gave me my first scholarship, the president of Sembradores, who was also female at that time, that gave me my first scholarships. And they advocated for me, and eventually I became the individual that advocated for others. So they planted the seed. I went on to the University of Houston undergraduate, got my undergraduate degree in Spanish, became a great secretary, really, legal paralegal, and I was bilingual, did great, and then I decided to go back to law school. I got my undergraduate degree and my law degree from the University of Houston, and I thank them so much. I became a prosecutor for 4.5 years, and that's where my eyes were open again, and I did not like what I saw. I saw just too many minority men that I was putting away, day in, day out, in Harris County jails. And that's when I said, something's going wrong. I needed to take a step back, and I decided to run for city council. I decided that if our community was going to get any better, we needed to be accepting of our diversity. And we, as women, were just as capable as our male counterparts to be the voices of change. And so it took a lot. I was told there was no way I could win. I had no name recognition. I had no money. I had no political base. But I had the passion and desire to serve. And the rest is history, as they say.
Thank you, Gracie. Thank you very much. And I understand the home economics thing because I failed sewing in junior high school. So, Nikki, what societal challenges in particular inspired you to want to spend your life fighting to right the wrong?
Well, there were
You have to use them.
Excuse me. There were so many. It's hard to pick out the most favorable one. I was always aware of the difference in treatment between males and females from the time I was very small. I also got another lesson that went along with that, however, and that was nothing you can do about it. So, you can complain, but this is the way the world is. I was raised by my grandmother and grandfather, and it certainly wasn't because my grandmother, who was always very encouraging of me, was discouraging in that sense. It was just simply that she knew no other life. And she wanted me and my sister to survive. And the best way to do that was to meet the right man eventually and settle down. Never really worked for me. Well, I can't say that. It did in a sense. By the way, I ended up finally going to the University of Houston, where I got both my bachelor's and master's degree, and then got my PhD from New York University. That education up until my graduate school days didn't do much for me in terms of giving me a different outlook on women's lives and what women could accomplish. In fact, some professors were downright blatant about the fact that, well, women can't do this and women can't do that, and women didn't do anything in my history classes. But when I got to NYU, there was a women's movement going on. It wasn't going on in Houston at that time, but it was going on in New York. And I was sort of enthralled by it because, after all, this was stuff I'd thought about for a very long time. And I got involved in the National Organization for Women, and I was getting time to write my dissertation, and I decided I would do something on women in politics. Well, to my all-male faculty members I went to and talked about the idea. There I thought I was on the cutting edge of doing something big, talking about women in politics, and they were 100% discouraging. Same old story. Well, there's really nothing to write about because women really never did anything. And so I proceeded on around them and started doing research in past work, and they were right, or I thought they were right. I found virtually nothing. Going back into the history of writing in political science, I came up with about 5 different articles about women. And I was feeling pretty hopeless. One of my faculty members sent me to a faculty member in the sociology department, and she said, go into the sociology area and the psychology area and see if you can get some help there. Well, did I get help? And what I found was women were taught not to be leaders, not to take charge, not to stand up and say what they wanted, certainly not to run for elective office, although the League of Women Voters had done an excellent job in getting women to vote. Running for office was something that was still a strange occurrence for women to do. And so I really did the study, and there were 60 women running that was when I was in New York, 60 women running in the New York City, Long Island area. And so I thought, well, I'll do my study of them. Like, the question is, why are they there? Because there's a zillion reasons why they shouldn't be there. And so I did, and that was the socialization of women and politics, and the message was, you don't belong. I wrote my dissertation. I learned so much. I learned so much from those women. Some of them, they learned so much, not from me, but they learned so much from running, because they found out that they were only recruited to run because you couldn't win that district, and so we might as well throw a woman in there, and you don't lose anything. But the ones who won were tough women. And they all were. They were remarkable women just to do what they did. And at the same time, the women's movement was going on in New York, and I was part of NOW. I soon founded another chapter on Long Island of the National Organization for Women, and I was caught. I was thought, it isn't that you can't do anything. You can do something. We just haven't done anything. But then, what did I even know about the women's suffrage movement? There was nothing in our books. We weren't talked about. It wasn't talked about. I didn't learn about the bravery of those women and what it took, the 75 years or so that it took to get the right of women to vote. So there was nothing to go on. There were no role models. There was nothing to learn very little to learn in school. The faculty wasn't interested, and so there I was. I did my dissertation. I met some wonderful women. I joined feminist organizations, and I knew where I was going from that point on in my life. I moved back to Houston and started teaching a couple courses in political science at the University of Houston. And then I applied for the position of the women's advocate and was appointed to that position some 48 years ago, or some awful number like that. And at that time, we'd been working, starting in 1972, trying to get the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, passed. As you know, did not successfully do that. The battle finally ended in 1982. But in the meantime, probably in fear of us moving our way into the Constitution, some marvelous federal legislation was passed. Title IX of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, credit legislation, Title IX covering education, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And so, here I am, the women's advocate. What is my job? Well, the fact is these things weren't being implemented. And I knew it was going to take an enormous amount. Besides, I was in city, and the city people weren't being treated fairly. None of the women were being treated fairly. And so my big effort was to, since there was little that was going to be done inside City Hall, mobilize women on the outside of City Hall. And that's what got me into big trouble with the members on the City Council, who thought I was a real left-wing, well, how did you put it?
Wacko crazy feminist.
Yeah, wacko crazy thing, whatever. And they decided they would reward me for my efforts by reducing my salary to $1 a year. Well, I really couldn't live on $1 a year. I thought about trying, but I thought that's impossible. The mayor salvaged me that time. That was Mayor Fred Hoffhines who first appointed me. Salvaged me that time and put me in with another label on the city budget. So I was able to keep on doing my work as the women's advocate. But then he decided not to run again, and a new mayor came in by the name of Jim McCon. And the first thing he did was go down to the all-male downtown Rotary and announce that the women's advocate, Nikki Van Hightower, was going to be fired. Well, I had just spoken to them. I got invited to speak all the time. The groups that disliked me the most seemed to be most intrigued by having me come and speak to them for some reason. But anyway, I spoke, and I went home that night after I was told by the media, by the way. The mayor never told me I was fired. I went home that night and I saw it on television, and there were all these men clapping. And I thought, what are they afraid of? I was being successful in mobilizing women, but on the whole, what power did we have? No woman had been elected to city government, so there was no advocate in a powerful role. And so I became that advocate, and later was able to help form the Houston Area Women's Center. And we did some of our own work from that point on. Thank you.
That's for sure. And I remember it was just enough to say at some point, Nikki Van Hightower was invited. Nikki Van Hightower was showing up, and you could see a group of people, men, pale. So just the mere idea that Nikki Van Hightower was going to show up was enough to scare the living you-know-what out of him. Okay, so thank you, Nikki. And Dorothy, I was thinking as we introduce you, I remember years ago when I had my breast cancer, nobody mentioned that I was living in Montreal. I grew up in Cleveland, but I was living in Montreal. No one mentioned the word breast in public. No one mentioned the word cancer in public. Certainly never mentioned breast cancer. And I remember sitting at lunch one day with 4 women, and 3 of us were talking about the fact that we were touched by breast cancer. And the male waiter said, "Oh, can I ask you a question? Because my mother just got diagnosed." So when out there, we can talk about it. We can't say the same thing about domestic and sexual violence. The same qualifiers are there today in terms of 4 women sitting at a table. 3 of them are not going to talk about the fact that they're survivors. So we have a long way to go in that regard. But thank God for you and what you're doing for breast cancer survivors. Dorothy, what was going on with you? What inspired you to spend, besides the fact that Dixie probably...
Well, Dixie was a big part of it. Now, unlike these 2 ladies, I was never, compelled to do this until I kind of got pushed into it. But I learned very early on, I always knew that there was something different about women. And when my father left my mother with 4 kids, 1 9 months old, when I was 10 years old, I learned real quick that women don't have a whole lot of say-so in much of anything. And our little family got pushed around from house to house, and she didn't have any education. And so when she was diagnosed with cervical cancer, I'd already left home, I was already married. She was working in a hospital, and she was having all these symptoms. But as a housekeeper, do you think she would have asked anyone? No. Did we not have a program out there then? The pap smear was already out. She could have gone to a clinic, but she didn't. She had too much pride. And I remember when I was with her at her deathbed, and when she was first diagnosed, when they did the surgery on her, they came in the room and they said, we're not going to tell her that it's metastasized. We're not going to even tell her that it's cancer. And everybody, male, everybody's around there, the doctor's saying, no, we don't need to tell her. She's only got 6 months to live. And so when I walked in the room, then Mama looked at me and she said, it's cancer, isn't it? And I said, yeah, Mom, it is. So when she died, I was 21, a long time ago. But I remember thinking, because she was in a charity hospital, and she never had any real care before she went into the hospital. But I remember thinking, I wonder what would have been different if she'd had insurance. Now, you know, Ellen, back then, insurance wasn't a big deal. So how the heck did I even think about that at 21? You know, that was the deal. That was what really got me started and thinking about why is there such difference if you're rich or poor, if you're a woman. And I just don't think there's any prejudice like that prejudice to poverty. It's awful. So when I got my first job, I've been real lucky. I had a female boss who encouraged me to go to college. I went to night school at U of H. It took me 10 long years just to get through that. I know. So, but my first job was at Bayshore Hospital, and that's where I met Dixie a few years later. And she was the second general surgeon who was second female to be graduated from the UTMB general surgeon residency. So, I mean, this woman was, talk about a force. You know, she stood about 5'7". She always wore heels. She always wore her skirts a little too tight, a little too short. And she could turn everybody into doing anything she wanted to, including me. But I was the marketing person there. And here she comes in talking about breast cancer. You know, they were doing mammograms, if you can call them that, at the hospital with the same machine you used to do a broken arm. Can you imagine how many rads were going through those breasts? So she insisted on a dedicated unit. My job was to go out there and get her, you know, places to talk. I am such an introvert, and she is not. Dixie could talk to the tree, but, you know, she would go out. I'd set all these things up. She'd go out and talk, and pretty soon, you know, Pasadena's not very big, y'all. One day I said, Dixie, you could, you know, this event tonight's going to be at so-and-so church right down here on Spencer. And she said, well, you're not going to go with me? I said, no, Dixie, it's like 7 blocks down here on Spencer. You can go by yourself. They're going to have everything ready. And she goes, oh, there won't be a friendly face there. You have to go with me. And I thought, what is with this woman? But from then on, she drugged me to everything. And it was such a gift. Because I'm sitting there in doctors' conferences, I'm sitting and I'm hearing her talk about breast cancer over and over. I tell you what, when we started the Rose, I hate that word, but fearless. I wasn't going to let anybody tell me anything about breast cancer. I had to learn from the best. But I did learn and see it over and over again that if you didn't have insurance and if you were poor, then you didn't get the same treatment at all. You know, we started the Rose, or just before we started the Rose, when the first conference was held here, a woman could go into the OR to have a biopsy and come out without her breast. And she would have no say in it. And that's what Rose Kushner told us when we met her at an international conference. Dixie was sitting there going, now Rose was my hero. Rose was a layperson. She wrote a book that explained to lay people what breast cancer was all about. And so I'd sent her this letter, you know, this is back before emails. My staff never believes this. But I sent her a letter and I said, Rose, I hear you're going to be at this conference. I'd love to have just a few moments of your time to talk about what Dr. Malillo is doing down in Houston. And she said, I have an evening free. Would you like to have dinner with me and Harvey? And so I go, wow, you know, I'm going to get to have dinner with Rose Kushner. So we go to dinner, and this is in a very fancy, fancy restaurant. You know, it has all this marble around and everything. And Dixie, very proper back then, was going on and on about all the education she was doing out in the community. You know, she was doing a talk every other night and really educating those women. And Rose leaned forward and said, well, tell me, Dixie, what are you doing with those women after you educate them? You just taking them to the edge of the cliff and pushing them off? And Dixie, of course, now, you know, doctor, remember? Female doctor, very strong. Nobody ever talked to her that way. And so she kind of got all huffy and said, well, you know, that's just the whole problem. The medicine costs so much. Mammograms cost so much. You know, no one wants to take care of these women. And so Rose leaned forward again, and she said, Dixie, will you quit your pissing and moaning and get off your, we use duff in public, and go start yourself a nonprofit and take care of those women. Now, you know what you have to know about Rose was she was a journalist for the Baltimore Sun. She was the first woman to cover Vietnam. She stood about 5 feet tall. She had a mouth on her that would embarrass anyone. And so when she was talking to Dixie, it was like, We came back to Houston thinking, you know, I'm a part of HCA's faculty. I am not going to start a nonprofit. Dixie's a general surgeon. She did not have she still doesn't have any idea about business. But, you know, it was like, there's no way we're going to do this. Rose Kushner called me every Friday, and she would say, what have you done about that nonprofit? Nothing. And then she'd say, next Friday, what congressperson have you called to get this Medicare bill through to cover screening? I'd say, I don't even know congresspeople. You know, every Friday she called me until finally I got off my duff. We turned our application in. And so I wrote her a letter, and I said, now, Dixie, we've decided to open up our center. We're going to Rose, we've decided to open up our center, and we're going to name it as a living tribute to you. Now, my maiden name was Rose. Dixie's married name at the time was Rose, and we'd met Rose Kushner. What were we going to call this place? So, no, that we could never have done that. So Rose called me back after she got the letter, and she said, what the hell do I need a living tribute for? I went, I cannot please this woman. But Harvey, her husband, told me later that every time she had a chance to talk, and she had plenty of chances, that she always mentioned there was a place down in Houston, Texas, that she had a little bit of something to do with. And you know, I always love to tell that story because everyone needs a Rose in her life. And if we don't have one, we need to be that. We need to be the Rose that will take the time and call and say, what have you done?
Thank you. Thank you very much. As you were talking, I was reminiscing a bit, too, about a program I started in Montreal, Reach to Recovery, which was going on here. And I remember when I first went to speak to the surgeons, all of whom were, what? Men. And I have nothing against them. I married one. I have 4 grandsons. But all the surgeons were men. And after I tried to get this idea across about this program, one of the doctors said, you know, we don't want any do-good women in our hospital rooms. And another surgeon said, I don't know what the big deal is about losing a breast. That was the attitude. But we got them going, didn't we?
Or you should be, why are you so vain? What are you worried about? You should be happy you're alive.
Yeah.
Yeah, when
right.
we talk about reconstruction.
That was it.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go on to where we are today and where we were 41 years ago when almost to the day when we had the 1977 Houston National Women's Conference. Just to give you an idea, if you just kind of close your eyes and I let you know what it was like back then, the median household income was $15,000. A gallon of gas cost 62 cents. A woman could still be fired for getting pregnant. The courts only recognized sexual harassment in the workplace that year, 1977, and marital rape was still legal in some states. It wasn't criminalized in all 50 states until 1993, and is still often treated differently by the courts. So I'm going to ask you, and start with you, Nikki, where were you at the time in 1977, either professionally, personally, or emotionally? And do you think the women's movement has come all that far since then? And I'm going to ask you all three of you the same question.
Well,
Microphone.
Thank you. I was the women's advocate in Houston in 1977. My days were numbered at that point. And I was very active in fact, having a women's advocate in the city of Houston was one of the reasons the national officials said they decided to have the conference in Houston. It was a marvelous, marvelous thing, but not in the sense that we came up with this list of policies that we wanted passed or enforced, or because once it was over, it was pretty much over. But it did some great things. It mobilized women. It mobilized me. I was in the business of trying to get a women's center started at the time, and it gave us enthusiasm, excitement. We met women from all over the country. We put together a network of women that we'd never had before. We met the famous women who we saw on television who would speak out for women, and here they were talking to us, and they were asking about what we were doing here in Houston. It was a thrilling moment. When I walked into that conference room the first time, I really felt like I had just been elected to the United States Senate and was walking into the chambers the first time. The presidents were there, the first ladies were there. It was a totally federally funded program. Can you imagine now? A totally federally funded program, which was a message to us that we were somebody. we deserved attention. There were issues that needed to be taken up. So in terms of what actually came out from from the decisions that were made at the conference, I have to say, not much. In terms of changes since that time, they were mainly driven by people like us, people who got out there and said, hey, there's laws on the books, and we're going to see that they're enforced. And that was something that has been handed down by generations. And when I taught courses in the Women's Studies program at the University of Houston, I listened to these young women, and although they didn't know a whole lot about feminism or the women's movement, their attitude about what they expected in life was so different from ours. It wasn't that, oh, there's nothing you can do about it. It's that they expected to be treated equally, they expected to be paid equally, and if they weren't, they thought there was something they could do about it, which there was. And so there was a pretty major shift in attitude, which meant activism.
Thank you. Gracie, what was going on with your life in 1977?
November of 1977, I had had my first child in the end of May of that year, and I needed to finish my undergraduate degree, so I was working full-time at Gulf Oil Corporation as in their law library, actually, as a file clerk. I wanted a job that didn't take too much effort. It was place air-conditioned, and I could study. So, but I had had the baby, and I was working full-time, and I was also going to school full-time at night. So it was a full day for me. But it was also during the time that the Jose Campos Torres situation was happening here in Houston. And there was a lot of consternation going on. And at the time, I was then married to a police officer who was a part of the police force, and there was a lot going on in terms of community concerns, and even my church at Our Lady of Guadalupe, there was always, this fear of the police and what was happening in our communities. So I remember all of that. I remember the women's conference that was going to be taking place. I wanted to go, but I couldn't because there was just too much on my personal plate at the time. But I really appreciated the fact that finally I felt that the women were going to be stepping up. And again, it was the fact that I had had my first child. I was allowed to take time off 30 days, but I wasn't paid. So they said if you don't come back by a certain time, then you don't have a job anymore. So there were issues that I was dealing with personally as well. But the most difficult time was, of course, the consternation that was going on, and the conflict between the predominantly white, police department against the minority communities, and a lot of that was happening.
Thank you. Dorothy, what was happening in 1977?
Well, my mother died in 73
Oh.
and left me with a brother and sister to raise. So I was pretty young, and, you just never should have to raise a teenager if you're not older. I mean, I was aware of it, and I just started to go to night school. But I want to tell you something. It was like I was reading everything that was going on about it. So, I don't know if we appreciate what that impact that would have had on someone like me, who I was making $2.13 an hour
Wow.
with these kids and trying to get them through. But still, it was like it was coming underground. It was like I was seeing it and hearing it. And so it was so mind-opening. And anytime I would try and talk to someone about it, because, I was in Pasadena, Texas, but every time that I would find a woman who knew what I was talking about, it was so exciting. So, I'm saying, yeah, it had impact. Yeah, heck yeah.
And I had just moved here about 3 weeks before the conference, so I never had a chance to attend it, but I've spent a lot of time reading about it. And I know that it was also the beginning of the shelter movement in this country, that shelters were one of the things we're talking about. In fact, I think the first shelter was in Great Britain, and then the Women's Center was only a matter of a couple of years once that.
Austin set up one, and then 6 months later, Houston set up one.
Yeah. Okay, so much of what each of you fights for is to erase a stigma of prejudice of some kind. Stigma surrounding breast cancer, against sexual assault and domestic violence, racism against women of color, sexism in general, and more. What types of strategies have you found to be successful in changing hearts and minds to be more open and tolerant? I know, Gracie, we'll start with you. I know you said you went, if the door is shut, you went over the roof and through the cellar and around the back door, but could you be a little more specific?
Well, I just batted my long
Microphone.
I said I just batted my long lashes at him and say, "Prudy, please, would you do it?" Not. Actually, it was interesting. There were moments when I would try to do something, like when I was on city council, and there were some directors back then that basically, when I would ask them for data, information, so that I could make a decision, they would look at me and they'd pat me in the back and say, now, pretty lady, we're going to handle this for you. You don't have to worry about anything. And I would, it would just take me aback for a moment. I'd breathe, because I really would want to say something really nasty to them, because it would anger me. But at the same time, I said, let me rise above it. And I would gently push back and say, I'm sorry, I don't believe you heard me. I need this data. I can make my own decision once I have the data. And they would look at me like, well, you don't have to get so gruff about it. And I said, I wasn't. So just give me the data. Now, it was interesting because I wanted a summary of the data. The next day I would come in, and on my desk was these reams of computer paper, this tall, this wide, sitting on my desk saying, there's the data, right? So my deal was like, okay, now what do I do? So I called the mayor's office and said, excuse me, Mayor, I needed a summary of the information regarding international travelers into the airport, and I needed to find out exactly where they're coming from. I have an enormous amount of data. I don't have enough staff. Do you think you might find someone from your department that may be able to give me a summary? Of course, they would then go back to their director, right, and ask for that summary. And I would ultimately get what I needed. And I was able to make a change based on that data. And part of it was them telling you, you cannot do this. You are overstepping your bounds. You are not an administrator. You are a policymaker. So again, learning how to go around it. And I said, you are right. I am a policymaker. Therefore, the next policy is going to be X, Y, and Z. And it would shock them and says, you can't do that. And I said, yes, I can. You told me I could. So it was sometimes taking what they said and turning it around and doing exactly what they said.
Well, thank you, because I know if I want to get a piece of paper now, thanks to you, I can get that information and not get a whole bunch of things.
Well, I heard they treated you more kindly, little lady.
Yeah, right. No one's ever called me a little lady, so... Dorothy, what about you? What strategies did you use to get things moving?
You know, I think we just hung in there.
I'm sorry?
We just hung in there. We just kept doing what we said we were going to do. And that was, you know, at a time when there was this misconception about uninsured people that we were trying to take care of. And it was like all the uninsured people had to be, you know, homeless and living under a bridge. It was never the low-paid people. That always just amazed me. But I also have such a huge staff of women, powerful women in their own rights. And you know, the interesting thing is they'll call me out anytime I'm not behaving right. I think that's great. You know, I think we've got to call each other out. And if I don't want to stand up for something, then they're in that office telling me what I need to do. So, you know, I've been really, really fortunate that it wasn't so much I had to fight that outside as I could build from the inside. And, you know, people are just amazed we even survived. You know that. They used to make such fun of the Rose, but we're still here 33 years later.
Oh, thank goodness.
I want to add to that,
Sure.
because I think it is about developing allies and surrounding yourself with allies that know what you're doing and what you're capable of. So I agree with you on that.
Thank you. That's a very good point. Nikki, did you have any strategies? I'm sure everybody fell over themselves to help you get things started, particularly the women. They were so eager to help women in those days.
You know, at first I didn't have strategies because I thought you just went in and you were hired to be a women's advocate. Well, you pretty much understand what that means, right? You're representing women. There were things to be done. There were laws that were not being enforced, and so that's what you did. I ran into a buzzsaw. I don't know whether it was the word advocate for women that made me suspect or what. If those of you who are old enough remember the Equal Rights Amendment, we were right in the heart of that. It went on from 1972 to 1982 to try to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed. And by that time, the country was pretty well divided on those who supported it and those who did not support it. And so it sort of spilled over into everything. And one of it was the women's advocate. And the women's advocate meant Equal Rights Amendment, you know, or the support of the Equal Rights Amendment, the support of abortion rights, the support of all of the things that would broaden women's lives. And so I ran into a lot of hostility. Almost anything I did on behalf of women, I would be harshly criticized until finally I got this shot in the head with the reduction of my salary to $1 a year. But in terms of strategy, because I did build it, I began to see what I was up against with this. I turned to outsiders. I turned to women in the community. And I've often thought about what that was exactly that happened. Was it that I was, because I did just an enormous amount of speaking. And some people, most of the time, I would come and my audience would have a certain attitude, and I would leave, and for all I understood, they had a certain attitude. But there was something that was going on during that period of time that I realized later. People thought about it. And it was sort of a broad-scale consciousness raising. I got a letter from a student of mine one time following a women's studies class, and I didn't even know who she was. She said in her letter that she sat in the back of the room sulking most of the time, thought this was nonsense and what, you know. She said, it took me about 6 months, now that was when I got the letter, and she said, it stayed with me the whole time. I thought about it, and I began to see it. I began to feel it. And she said, I know exactly now what it is that you were talking about. And I think in many ways, in many cases, that really happened. Fathers left, and they looked at their daughters, and they thought about their opportunities they were going to have in life. They listened to their wives about the things that were going on at work and what was happening there, and their eyes began to open up to that. And then there were these massive numbers of people out there who were already feminists, women's advocates. They just didn't know it. And so it was a matter of raising their consciousness. They believed in all those things. They just didn't know or didn't know how to do something about it. And so they were awakened. And so that was much of what my strategy turned out to be. Talk, talk, talk. And then when I was fired from the city, they didn't know what they were getting into, because I was immediately hired by KTRH Radio to have a talk show that went on 3 hours in the afternoon. And I talked, and I talked. I only lasted a year there when the owners of the station decided that I was too much for them too. And, but that was all right. Then I went to work for the Women's Center and as their president. And attitudes toward me changed so rapidly when I went to work for the Women's Center, because we were dealing with abused women. And that was something they could understand. People could understand. That was a natural, traditional role. Help women, help injured women. It wasn't always that way. But as opposed to equality for women, which was a whole different matter.
And I know in my own personal life that one of the strategies I've used to try and be successful, or to get, when I'd served in the legislature for 2 terms, the one big issue I was trying to pass was a $5 fee on sexually oriented businesses, or SOBs as we called them. And what it meant was that if you went to a strip club, if it cost $20 to get in, then we added a $5 fee on there, and that money went to provide rape crisis programs around the state, as well as education programs, thank you, and others. But I knew I couldn't get it passed as a group of women on the floor, since we're only 35 women out of 150. So I had to work to get men involved. And granted, most of the men told me they'd never been to one of those strip clubs in their whole life, but even so, as I described what it was, I was able to get them involved. And I've always found that if I can find someone on the other side of the issue who's open to listening, and who we can phrase domestic violence, whose mother may have been a survivor, if we're talking about choice and we're not using their language but our own language, and get someone from the other side to kind of help me carry it, then I could usually get things through. So I'm sure we've all used that strategy. Well, the final question we have is, the national conversation around Me Too has grown to engulf all industries in the past couple of years. Women from all over the world stood up to share their stories of sexual harassment and assault publicly for the first time, including myself. How do you see this wave impacting the women's movement, particularly younger activists, and what their approach to activism might be in the future as a result? And I know we can't be political, but I would tell you that even at this moment, I think the vote is being taken in Washington, and we know what the outcome is going to be. And so I put this in your laps about what's the future. We'll start with you.
Thank you for telling your story, Ellen. Because when I read that, I thought, someday I'm going to have that much courage. You know, there's still lots and lots that don't have that courage. And what I see, because my staff is all women, and I watch the young ones in the middle, and you know, the wonderful thing about Me Too is at least it's okay now to tell. And the other thing that I think has changed is, from your story and my story perhaps, is that there was no one who would have stood up for me. And you know, that's the other part of what Me Too is saying, who's going to stand up for us? Now, I think so much that is going on right now is just flat, what's the word, polarizing, you know, and I feel, and I may be the only one up here that feels this way, but I feel for the good guys. You know, my husband is a good guy. There's lots of good guys in this world, just like the ones that you've had. And they're more confused than most of us. I mean, it's just, they just don't get it because they are the good guys. So I hope that somewhere in this dialogue that we find that middle ground somehow. You know, it reminds me of what we used to talk about, the matchbook theory. Do y'all, probably too young to remember that, but remember when they used to have the little matchbooks that the lid came up, the cover came up, and it was, you had to move it all the way over here before it would come back to center. And I think that's part of what's going on right now, but I sure hope that we aren't silenced again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Nikki?
I would take a chance and say, if I went through this room and asked every woman if she had been sexually harassed, sexually threatened, raped, that I'd probably get 95% yes. Certainly has happened to me. You know, I can't even remember all the incidents. I have to, when the Me Too movement came up and I started thinking about it, I thought, wait a minute. Oh, but there was then that, oh, I remember that night. Oh, I remember I was at I don't know how many times. The vast majority of the time I didn't do anything about it. I just walked away, stayed away from the person, whatever. Tried to survive in life with it, starting in my own family, by the way. I think this movement is wonderful. I don't know where it's going to go. And yes, there are wonderful men out there. I've had the opportunity to spend my life, a good portion of my life with one of them. But there must be an awful lot of really sorry individuals out there too, because there can't be that many women who experience this if there aren't men to carry out the other side. So I think this is a big movement, and I think it's going to hang on, and I think, yes, we should try to get to the center and certainly protect the ones who, the men who do not involve themselves in that. But you know, there isn't a woman alive, I don't think, who hasn't been told, be careful, be careful, be careful where you go at night. Be sure you have your keys in your hand. Lock the door. Don't talk to a strange man. Don't talk. There's a message out there. This is an environment that we live in, and most of us live in our whole lives. So something is terribly wrong.
Graciela?
So I have numerous occasions had to deal with unwanted sexual advances and comments. Most of the time I would outsmart them or, you know, a little reply like looking at them and saying, was it something I said, something I did to make you believe that I was that type of a woman? If so, I apologize. Because I wanted them to know that I would not stand for it. You know, I had to take a stand. And I think it does start with us ourselves, right? We have to be assertive. We have to, you know, have our boundaries. But part of it is also teaching our children, our grandchildren. These are our boundaries, and you do not let other people cross those boundaries without permission. And I don't know whether we've done that enough. And I know that when it's with my sons, and again, you know, we're mothers, you know, and our children are, and we're raising these young men. What are we thinking? What role do we play in what is taking place as well as women? And I think that is part of the discussion, is within our own circles, that the people that we touch, the people that we motivate and inspire and can impact, what are we doing? And how do we play into it?
Thank you. I'd like to end with something that a friend of mine, Jill Ruckelshaus, said as chair of the National Women's Political Convention in 1977. And Jill is a good friend of mine for any number of years. She said this at the end of the conference. And the sad part is, in light of what's going on today, I think she could say it now, and I'm certainly going to end with it. This is what she said. We are in for a very, very long haul. I'm asking for everything you have to give. We will never give up. You will lose your youth, your sleep, your patience, your sense of humor, and occasionally the understanding and support of people that you love very much. In return, I have nothing to offer you but your pride in being a woman and all your dreams you've ever had for your daughters and nieces and granddaughters. Your future and the certain knowledge that at the end of the day, of your days, you will be able to look back and say that once in your life, you gave everything you had for justice, end quote. Be sure and vote. Thank you. Thank you all very much.